The economic impact of the Chinese Communist Party's city lockdown and zero COVID measures is gradually becoming more apparent. Although the GDP figures for April are not yet available, on April 30th, the National Bureau of Statistics of China released key data on the manufacturing sector. The Purchasing Managers' Index (PMI) for the manufacturing sector was 47.4% in April, down another 2.1% from March. The Non-Manufacturing Business Activity Index was 41.9% in April, down 60.5% from the previous month, both the lowest since March 2020, and both below 50 per PMI readings, indicating contraction in production and the economic downturn has worsened. China's economy grew by 4.8% in the first quarter of the year, below the 5.5% target set at the beginning of the year, and Guangdong, the country's largest GDP contributor, grew by only 3.3% year-on-year. Shanghai, China's largest economic and commercial center, reported 3.1% GDP growth in the first quarter, well below the national average. Shanghai only implemented a full-scale lockdown on March 28th, before which most enterprises' production was in normal conditions. But this has already caused a 7.7% year-on-year drop in GDP in March, compared to 11.9% growth in January-February. In April, Shanghai was almost completely under lockdown. According to economic modeling by some Hong Kong academics, a one-month closure in Shanghai would result in a 54% reduction in real monthly income and a 2.5% to 3% loss in GDP for April compared to the same month in 2021. In light of the impact of the pandemic, some international organizations and economists have lowered their forecasts for China's economic growth this year. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, lowered its forecast for China's economic growth this year from 4.8% to 4.4%. UBS lowered its original forecast of 5% to 4.2%. And Nomura Holdings chief China economist Lu Ting said that the impact of the pandemic on the entire Chinese economy has exceeded his personal forecast and market forecast, and cautiously gave a figure of 4.3%. In a video of a meeting viewed by the Financial Times, Wei Jianshan, CEO of Asia's largest private investment group, Pacific Alliance Group, which manages more than $50 billion of assets, criticized the Chinese government's COVID policy, saying they have led to a deep economic crisis that is comparable to the 2008 global financial crisis. He stated, "The market sentiment towards Chinese stocks is at the lowest point in the past 30 years. I also think popular discontent in China is at its highest point in the past 30 years." Sensing the pressure on the economy, the CCP Central Committee held 3 top-level finance-related meetings from April 26 to 29th and issued a rare admission that the economy is facing a huge challenge. In order to stabilize the economy and preserve employment, the CCP is taking a series of measures, but at the same time, it still emphasizes that dynamic clearing policy will not waver. The dynamic clearing refers to relying on local governments to stamp out local outbreaks. Since the virus outbreak in Wuhan in 2020, the communist authorities have been taking strict measures to seal off cities for epidemic prevention. According to some academics, China's 333 administrative cities of medium size and above have been closed at least 403 times since April 2020 until April 18, 2022. Some cities have been closed multiple times. For example, Ruili City in Yunnan Province has been closed 9 times for more than 160 days. There are still about 90 cities in China that are under lockdown. It is often the case that after a city is dynamically cleared and reopened, another city would be closed soon after an epidemic breaks out, and the pattern continues in a vicious cycle. Some scholars estimate that China's dynamic zero policy will continue until at least 2024. The 4 first-tier cities in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou have fallen victim to the epidemic, with Shenzhen and Guangzhou being sealed off in March. Shanghai is still under lockdown, and Beijing is currently experiencing an outbreak, with some areas already closed off. According to data released by the China Statistics Bureau in 2021, the total GDP of these four cities reached $2.15 trillion, accounting for 12.45% of the country's total GDP. Although some cities have not been sealed off themselves, they have already experienced the lockdown effect due to the closure of other cities, the disruption of the supply chain, and transportation caused by the lockdown of other cities. As the largest city and port in China, Shanghai has many production lines and bases for international companies and has close supply chain ties with other provinces and cities. The impact of Shanghai's lockdown on the industrial chain is most obvious, especially in the semiconductor and automobile manufacturing industries. The economic shockwaves from the lockdown have been cascading, disrupting the global supply chain and halting production in China where there is no outbreak. Shanghai's integrated circuit industry accounts for about a quarter of the country's total size and is the largest IC manufacturing center in China. Since the city's closure, many companies have been forced to shut down or even consider pulling out. For example, ON Semiconductor, the global automotive semiconductor giant, announced on April 18th that it was closing its global distribution center in Shanghai and relocating operations to Singapore. ON Semiconductor is one of the top 10 semiconductor suppliers to the automotive industry, providing more than 80% of the world's electronic components for the automotive sensing sector. TSMC, a leader in semiconductor production, and SMIC, the largest chip maker in China, are currently adopting a closed-loop production model, where only some employees can return to the production line, which directly affects production capacity. This situation has also disrupted the global supply chain and extended the global chip shortage. Shanghai, China's automotive hub, produced 2,833,200 vehicles in 2021, accounting for nearly 11% of the country's total vehicle production. Not only are there car companies such as Volkswagen, GM, and Tesla, but there are also foreign parts giants such as Bosch and Aptiv, as well as a large number of local auto supply chain leaders, making it the largest auto parts production base in China. Shanghai continues to be under lockdown. So many car production plants and parts manufacturers have stopped production or cannot operate normally due to logistics disruptions. Some media outlets estimate that the Tesla Shanghai factory shut down for around 3 weeks this time. Based on the production of about 2,100 cars per day, Tesla's Shanghai factory could not produce about 44,100 cars. Data show that China's auto industry was heavily affected by the disruption of the supply chain in Shanghai, with auto production falling in 15 provinces year on year. On April 16th, Shanghai Municipal Commission of Economy and Informatization announced a list of the first batch of enterprises to resume production, including 666 key enterprises, such as integrated circuits, automobile manufacturing, equipment manufacturing, biomedical, and other key industries. However, because Shanghai requires the companies who resume operations to be under closed management, employees have to take a nucleic acid test twice a day, and the company also has to bear the relevant responsibility. These resumption conditions were seen as too harsh, and many foreign companies refused to resume work. This is only the impact of the closure of one city, and there are many other cities that are in a state of complete or semi-lockdown, which has an obvious impact on the economy. Under the influence of this unpredictable lockdown, foreign capital and foreign companies are continuing to withdraw. According to data, China's foreign investment loss reached a record high of $17.5 billion in March, and overseas investors accelerated their sales of Chinese government bonds to a record high of $8.1 billion in March. At the same time, Chinese funds absorbed only $1.4 billion in the first quarter of this year, down 70% from the previous quarter. In early April, the yield on China's 10-year government bonds fell below the yield on U.S. Treasuries for the first time in 12 years, accelerating the withdrawal of foreign capital. The RMB-USD exchange rate hit a 6-month low. In March, the cumulative net outflow of funds from Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong Stock Exchange was nearly $6.825 billion. By the end of March, China's foreign exchange reserves dropped by $25.8 billion compared with the end of February. For some small and medium-sized enterprises, the closure of the city is fatal. According to the South China Morning Post, in the first 11 months of 2021, 4.37 million small and medium-sized enterprises in China closed down, while the number of newly registered enterprises fell by 78.46%. The total number of small and medium businesses in Shanghai is more than 320,000, accounting for more than 99% of legal entities. The number of employees is nearly 7.16 million, accounting for 85% of the total number of employed persons. And the business's revenue accounts for nearly 70% of the total business revenue of legal entity in Shanghai. The pandemic has caused heavy losses to most Shanghai businesses, especially those small and medium-sized ones. For example, a Weibo article that has been deleted mentioned, Shanghai, the day the lockdown is lifted, is the day of bankruptcy and unemployment. According to a joint survey conducted by Peking University and Group Research Institute and e-commerce banks in March, nearly 40% of micro and small businesses' cash flow can only sustain them for less than 1 month. This means that if the pandemic continues for another month and strict pandemic prevention and control measures are maintained, they will be at risk of closing down. In addition, about 80% of respondents expect cash flow problems within 3 months or less. The service sector has also been hit hard. Waves of city closures are occurring across China, with stores and service-based businesses shutting down in large numbers. According to Xinhua News, there are currently 5 major industries in special hardship in China, including catering, retail, tourism, civil aviation, transportation, etc. The withdrawal of foreign companies, the closure of enterprises, and the downturn in the service industry have led to massive unemployment. According to Chinese officials, the unemployment rate in 31 cities rose to 6% in March, the highest level in history. This statistics does not include the large number of unemployed rural workers who have returned to their hometowns due to the outbreak. According to Chinese government, China now has 200 million workers who are flexibly employed, basically semi-unemployed. As we mentioned in the last video, there are still 10.76 million fresh graduates from colleges and universities this year, and a large portion of them will enter the job markets, which will intensify the competition. This is why Premier Li Keqiang has repeatedly stressed the importance of preserving jobs, because the employment situation in China is so dire. China's pandemic prevention measures have also struck local government revenues. Some people have calculated the impact of the 1-month closure of Shanghai on the city government's finances. The total cost of fighting the pandemic, including the construction of the isolation site, nucleic acid testing, and antigen testing, was approximately 12.7 billion RMB. In addition, the Shanghai government lost 4.028 billion RMB in taxes and 10 billion RMB in rental income from state-owned assets. With the reduction in revenue and additional expenses, the Shanghai government lost 27.7 billion RMB in 1 month. In the city of Suzhou, an economic hub in Jiangsu province, news has also emerged that the daily cost of nucleic acid testing plus the cost of medical care, volunteers, and security guards is nearly 200 million RMB, and that the recent tax returns from businesses are about 7 billion RMB, causing the government to fall short of its budget. The government is now reporting to Jiangsu province, requesting that normal conditions be restored after the May Labor Day holiday. In addition, with the ongoing debt crisis in the real estate industry, most real estate companies have stopped leasing land use rights from the government. According to a chart circulating on the internet showing the land transfer revenue, government revenue from land sales of 31 provinces and municipalities in the first quarter of this year, only Beijing has increased by 81.9%, while all other 30 provinces and municipalities have dropped. Among them, Tianjin, Chongqing, Shanghai fell by more than 90%. The worst drop was 100% in Tibet, where not a single piece of land was sold from January to March. As we have mentioned many times in previous videos, local governments in China rely heavily on the sale of land use rights for their fiscal revenues, and the current downturn in real estate has had a predictable impact on local fiscal revenues. Some netizens say that the current outbreak has not been cleared, but rather the government's finances have been cleared. With such a huge impact on China's economy, the Chinese Communist Party still insists on dynamic zero policy. What is the reason for this? Some analysts say that the CCP wants to prove at all costs that they have institutional superiority in controlling the outbreak over Western countries, especially the United States. There may be reasons for this, but we believe that the CCP may have a deeper political agenda in doing so. One being that Xi Jinping is using his success in fighting the pandemic as capital for his re-election, and the other being that the international community is now increasingly vocal about sanctions against China, which could ultimately lead to China's disconnection from the world. The Communist Party is using the pandemic prevention and control to test the people's resilience and to pave the way for its future isolation from the international community and its change to the North Korean model of rule. Thirdly, the economic stagnation caused by the closure of the cities will accelerate the overall poverty of the people. Under the CCP's mindset, if the people cannot be fed and clothed, they will be grateful for any assistance they can get, which will facilitate CCP's rule, just as the North Koreans will be moved to tears when they see Kim Jong-un.